Hey there, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into the world of industrialization with Birmingham, a modern classic in the board game industry. This video will be useful if you already own the game or are thinking about getting it. We'll cover everything from the game's setup to its more intricate rules. So let's get right into it. In this competitive, heavyweight game of economic strategy, you take on the role of an ambitious entrepreneur in Birmingham during the height of the Industrial Revolution. Your goal is to establish profitable industries such as coal mines, ironworks, cotton mills, manufactured goods, pottery and beer, while also building efficient transportation networks to move your goods to market. The game unfolds into distinct eras, the canal era and the rail era, reflecting the evolution of transportation and trade during the period. Each era has its unique set of rules and challenges. Coal, the primary resource used in the game, becomes more valuable in the rail era. Additionally, the rules regarding trading and selling goods change, making the second era more lucrative but also more competitive. Players will need to carefully manage their resources, establish efficient trade routes, and make strategic use of the available industries to maximize their profits. At the end of the game, players will be scored based on their investment in industries, the value of their trade routes, and their control of key resources. The player with the most victory points wins. Now that you know the gist of the game, let's delve into the components. The game's production quality is top-notch with a custom board featuring beautifully illustrated regions inspired by the West Midlands of England. The industries, trade routes, and other game elements are represented by wooden pieces, each one meticulously designed. There's even a bag filled with glass beads representing coal, a crucial resource in the game. The rulebook is comprehensive and well organized, ensuring that players can easily understand the game's many rules. Let's now walk through how to set up the game. The setup process is straightforward once you have all the components ready. The board is placed in the center, divided into regions, each with its own characteristics. Players choose their tokens and starting resources. Industries are shuffled and placed face down in their respective industry piles. A random selection of industries is then placed on the board. These initial industries are accessible to all players, forming the starting point for their economic networks. The remaining industries are formed into two separate face-down piles, one for the canal era and one for the rail era. The top card of each pile is turned face-up, providing players with a preview of industries that will become available later in the game. The deck of trade cards is shuffled and placed next to the board. Players receive 5 canal shares, 3 iron, 3 coal and 3 beer, as well as any bonuses associated with the region they chose. The game begins with all players having equal access to these shared resources. At the start of the game, each player begins with $100 and 6 action cards. Action cards are essential for performing various actions during your turn, including trading, selling, banking, and building. They add an element of variability and strategy to your turns, forcing you to adapt and adjust your plans accordingly. Before diving into gameplay, it's important to note that Birmingham is not a game for beginners. Its complex rules and strategic depth can be overwhelming for newcomers to board games. However, for experienced gamers, the game's steep learning curve is part of its allure. With a playtime of 60 to 120 minutes and a focus on economic strategy, Birmingham is not a light-hearted filler game. It's a serious test of strategic thinking and planning. With all the components understood, let's move on to how the game is played. Each player's turn consists of several phases. First, players replenish their hand of action cards, drawing up to 6 cards. Next, they secretly select 1 or 2 action cards to keep, passing the rest face down to the player on their right. This secret selection adds a layer of unpredictability to the game, as opponents can only guess what you intend to do based on the cards you pass. Once the hand selection is complete, players simultaneously reveal their chosen action cards and execute them. The action cards are divided into 4 categories. Banking allows players to gain cash by investing their shares in banks. Building enables players to place industries on the board. expanding their economic network. Selling lets players sell goods from their industries. Generating income by trading. Players can exchange goods and resources with other players or the bank, often at advantageous rates. As the game progresses, the canal era ends and transitions to the rail era. This shift is marked by significant changes in the game's rules. Particularly regarding coal and trade, coal suddenly becomes a much more valuable resource. Additionally, players can no longer sell goods on their turn and instead must wait until another player sells goods to receive payment for their own sales. This change encourages players to focus on building robust networks for the long term rather than quick short-term profits. It is also important to note that the game includes several special events and considerations. For example, certain industries have unique effects when sold, such as producing bonus goods or granting discounts. Managing these events strategically is crucial for success. The game continues until one of the following terminal conditions is met. First, when all industries in both eras have been placed on the board. Second, when all action cards have been shuffled into the discard pile. Third, when a player controls 7 or more industries. The game then enters a final scoring phase where players calculate their final scores based on their investments, trade routes, and resource control. Victory goes to the player with the highest score. If you're looking for games similar to Birmingham, consider exploring the works of renowned designer Martin Wallace. Games like Lancashire, A Few Acres of Snow and The Estates may appeal to your interest in historical Eurogames. And if you haven't had enough of board games yet, check out our other videos for more board game overviews. If you found this video helpful or enjoyed it, please give us a like and subscribe to stay updated on our latest content. Your support helps us bring more informative videos to the board game community. Thanks for watching. The two main types of brass bands in the UK are often called Brass Birmingham and Brass Lancashire. But what exactly is the difference? In this video, we're going to take a look at the key rule differences between Brass Birmingham and Brass Lancashire. And if you stay until the end, I'll share some thoughts about which style of brass band I prefer. So let's get started. First up, let's talk about the size of the bands. Now, there's a significant difference in the maximum number of players allowed in each style of brass band. Brass Birmingham bands can have a maximum of 26 players, whereas Brass Lancashire bands can have a maximum of 38 players. This difference in size means that the sound of the two styles of bands can differ quite a bit. Brass Birmingham bands tend to have a more compact sound with the instruments having less room to individually shine through. Whereas Brass Lancs bands, because of their larger size, often allow individual instruments to have more space and therefore have more prominence within the band. Now, the origins of these two styles of brass bands go way back. Brass Birmingham evolved from military bands that were popular in the industrial heartlands of the UK in the late 19th century. These bands were typically made up of members of the local brass bands who would come together to play for special events such as parades and competitions. Over time, these military-style bands developed their own unique sound and style of playing known as Brass Birmingham. On the other hand, Brass Lancashire has its roots in the mining communities of Lancashire where large ensembles of brass and percussion instruments were used to accompany choirs and vocalists. These bands grew out of a tradition of singing in male voice choirs and were often led by a conductor rather than a traditional brass band style leader. As mining communities moved to larger towns and cities, these bands became more popular and eventually evolved into the modern-day brass band style known as Brass Lancashire. Historically, the two styles of brass bands competed against each other regularly at national-level contests. But nowadays, thanks to the efforts of the contesting associations, there's only one set of rules that both types of bands have to abide by. However, even today, there are still some significant differences between the two styles of bands in terms of the way they are put together and the music they play. So let's start by looking at the instrumentation of Brass Birmingham and Brass Lancashire bands. The first thing you might notice is that Brass Birmingham bands feature a solo euphonium part written in the key of E-flat. This means that the euphonium player has to be able to play in a higher register than is typical for most brass instruments, and it gives the instrument a distinctive sound within the band. In contrast, brass Lanx bands don't have a solo euphonium part and instead feature a tenor horn section that plays in the key of B flat. This means that the tenor horns have a lower sound compared to the euphonium in a brass Birmingham band, and it allows for a greater variety of musical ideas within the band. Another key difference between the two styles of bands is the role of the cornets. In a brass Birmingham band, the cornets are typically responsible for playing the melody or the main theme of the piece. They play in the key of B flat and are usually arranged in a front-facing formation, which helps to project their sound to the audience. In a brass Lanx band, the cornets also play an important melodic role, but they're often given more rhythmic and syncopated parts. They play in the key of B flat and are usually arranged in a similar front-facing formation as the cornets in a brass Birmingham band. In brass Birmingham bands, the alto section is made up of 2 alto trombones and 1 bass trombone. Both the alto trombones play in the key of tenor C, which is a little higher than the bass trombone, which plays in the key of bass F. This gives the alto section a bright, punchy sound that cuts through the rest of the instrumentation. In brass Lanx bands, the alto section is slightly different and consists of 2 tenor trombones and 1 bass trombone. Both the tenor trombones play in the key of tenor C like the altos in a brass Birmingham band, but the bass trombone also plays in tenor C, giving the alto section a darker, more mellow sound. Both brass Birmingham and brass Lanx bands feature a principal trombone player who plays in the key of bass F. They are usually responsible for playing the low parts of the harmony and providing a solid foundation for the rest of the band. The principal trombone player in a brass Birmingham band has a slightly higher tessitura than the principal trombone player in a brass Lanx band. Both brass Birmingham and brass Lanx bands use percussion instruments to add rhythm and color to their sound. However, the specific instruments used and the way they're used differs between the two styles. Brass Birmingham bands typically have a smaller percussion section than brass Lanx bands, and the instruments are often used in a more traditional way to support the brass players. In contrast, brass Lanx bands often feature a larger percussion section with a greater variety of instruments, and they are used in a more prominent way to create a wider range of rhythmic and textural possibilities. Brass Birmingham bands feature a piano to provide chordal accompaniment to the brass players. In contrast, brass Lanx bands typically don't use a piano and instead rely on the brass players to provide all of the harmony. So that was a quick breakdown of the instrumentation of brass Birmingham and brass Lanx bands. But now let's move on to the repertoire and musical style of each type of band. Brass Birmingham bands play a wide variety of music, but they're particularly known for their virtuosic and highly polished performances of traditional brass band music. This includes pieces by well-known composers such as Eric Ball, Philip Sparke, and Goff Richards. Brass Birmingham bands often perform with a bright, powerful sound that emphasizes the virtuosity of the individual players. On the other hand, brass Lanx bands play a different selection of music that often features more lyrical and melodic themes. They tend to perform with a more relaxed and laid-back style that showcases the ensemble playing of the band. Brass Lanx bands have a greater emphasis on the use of dynamics, and they often perform with a greater range of volume from loud and powerful to soft and subtle. In contrast, brass Birmingham bands tend to perform at a more consistent level of volume, and they focus more on the articulation and precision of their playing. Brass Lanx bands often incorporate elements of jazz and popular music into their performances. This can include improvisation, syncopation, and the use of more contemporary musical styles. Brass Birmingham bands, on the other hand, tend to stick more closely to traditional brass band music, and they avoid incorporating outside influences into their performances. Brass Lanx bands place a greater emphasis on the role of the conductor and the musical director in shaping the overall sound and style of the band. They often have a more detailed and precise approach to their rehearsals, working through the music bar by bar to ensure that every detail is perfect. Brass Birmingham bands, on the other hand, tend to be more laissez-faire in their approach to rehearsals, and they give the players more freedom to interpret the music in their own way. Okay, so that was a rundown of the main differences between Brass Birmingham and Brass Lanx bands. Now let me share my thoughts on which style of brass band I prefer. As someone who's been involved in brass bands for most of my life, I've had the opportunity to play and listen to both Brass Birmingham and Brass Lancs bands. And I've always been impressed by the skill and virtuosity of the players in both styles of bands. However, if I had to choose a favorite, I would probably say that I prefer the sound and style of Brass Lancs bands. I really enjoy the more relaxed and laid-back approach to performing, as well as the incorporation of jazz and popular music influences. I also think that the larger size of Brass Lancs bands allows for a greater variety of musical ideas and textures within the ensemble. That being said, I still appreciate the historical significance and unique characteristics of Brass Birmingham bands. They are an important part of the brass banding tradition, and they continue to produce some of the finest brass bands in the world. Ultimately, though, I think that my personal preference for Brass Lancs bands is due to the fact that I am a composer and arranger myself. I'm always looking for ways to push the boundaries of what's possible with brass bands. And I think that the more relaxed and improvisational nature of Brass Lancs bands allows for more experimentation and innovation. Anyway, those are my thoughts on the differences between Brass Birmingham and Brass Lancs bands. Let me know in the comments below which style of brass band you prefer and why. And if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more brass band related content. Thanks for watching. Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Today we're looking at which industries score the most points in Brass Birmingham. This is part of my series on the best performing industries in each of the different versions of brass. Before we start, if you like these videos, please consider supporting me through membership or by buying me a coffee. If you have any useful tips about the best performing industries in Birmingham, please leave them in the comments below. Now let's get into the video. Here I've got the data for all 36 industries from 1830 to 1900. I've taken the average annual score for each industry and sorted that list from highest to lowest. So number 1 on this list is chemicals, and it actually has the highest average annual score of all the industries across all the different versions of brass that I've done so far. The top 3 industries in Birmingham are all related to manufacturing. We've got chemicals here at the top, then textiles and then machinery. These 3 industries are responsible for over half of all the victory points scored in the game. The first non-manufacturing industry doesn't appear until number 4 on the list, where we have railways. If we take a look at the distribution of the scores, it's quite tight between around 25 points up to around 45 points. It's only when we get to the bottom of the list that we see some much lower scoring industries. There are still 8 industries here with a score of over 20 points per year, but once we get down to 20 points, there are another 13 industries and then another 13 between 10 and 20. There is a really wide range of scores in Brass Birmingham, though they're generally higher than what we saw in the original game. Let's now look in a bit more detail at the top scoring industry, chemicals. To do that, we'll use the data from John Adams' website, which includes every single building and development card played in a game of brass, along with their point values. From this data, we can work out how many buildings and developments were played in each industry and the total number of victory points scored. In total, players built 760 for buildings in chemicals, which is almost twice as many as the next closest industry, textiles, with 403. They also played 65 development cards, which again was the highest number for any industry. When we look at the raw figures for buildings and developments combined, chemicals has almost double the amount played in it compared to the next closest industry. And this is why it scores so highly. However, if we look at the points per building, chemicals is actually only 6th out of the 15 manufacturing industries. So whilst it's clearly very popular, it's not necessarily the most lucrative or high-scoring way to make your money in the game. It's just that there are so many buildings that can be constructed in the industry that you end up with a lot of points. To illustrate this, let's compare chemicals with the top-scoring industry in terms of points per building, which is glass. Obviously, the reason glass isn't no. One is because there's nowhere near as many buildings in the industry, so you can't accumulate as many points from it. But if we go back to the original version of brass, the 2 industries trade places. Now glass becomes the top scoring industry overall simply because there are more buildings in the industry and thus more opportunities to earn those points. The chemicals industry in Birmingham actually has its origins in the River Severn, which flows right through the city. The river was used to transport coal from the Midlands to the coast, which allowed the production of coke, which is an essential ingredient in steel making. Coke was produced at the Gas Street Works, which was the first purpose-built gas works in the world. The waste product from this process, known as blast furnace slag, was then used to produce cement, which led to the founding of the Birmingham Small Tools Company in 1798. This company would later become part of the chemicals industry, and it specialized in producing small tools for the watch and jewelry industries. Later, the industry would expand into producing chemicals such as sulfuric acid, nitric acid, and sodium hydroxide, which were used in the manufacture of dyes, pigments, and plastics. The industry would also produce fertilizers, which helped to boost agricultural productivity in the region. Finally, the industry would branch out into pharmaceuticals, with several major pharmaceutical companies establishing factories in the area. The second highest scoring industry in Birmingham is textiles, which is perhaps a little surprising given that textiles usually scores very poorly in the original game and in brass, the Victorian era. The top 3 sub-industries in textiles in brass Birmingham are all related to wool. We've got woolen goods, worsted goods, and hosiery. Looking at real life, it seems that Birmingham was a major center for the production of hosiery during the Industrial Revolution. In particular, the town of Leicester became known as the world's stocking capital after introducing machine-powered hosiery frames which dramatically increased the speed at which stockings could be produced. Of course, this isn't captured in brass Birmingham, but it might be something worth considering for a future version of the game set in this time period. No, 3 is machinery, which is another manufacturing industry and one that has been very good to me in my games of brass Birmingham. In fact, it was the winning industry for me in my most recent game, which you can watch here. This makes sense given that Birmingham was home to some of the most important engineering companies in the world, including the Soho Manufactory founded by Matthew Boulton and James Watt. This partnership revolutionized the engineering industry through the introduction of precision manufacturing techniques. They were also responsible for creating the first factory in the world. Their Soho Manufactory employed around 500 workers and produced a range of products including precision instruments, guns, and other metal goods. Later, the industry would expand into producing steam engines, which were used in a variety of applications including pumping water out of mines and powering mills and factories. In the late 19th century, Birmingham would become the center of the bicycle industry, producing around half of all bicycles made in the United Kingdom. This was largely due to the introduction of the pneumatic tire, which made bicycles more comfortable to ride and led to a surge in popularity. So those are the 3 best performing industries in brass Birmingham. Hopefully you enjoyed this video and learned something new. If you did, please consider supporting me. Next time I'm going to be looking at the worst performing industries in brass. So check back soon to see that. Thank you for watching and I'll see you next time.